Good morning and good Easter Sunday to those who celebrate. I am coming at you from my office right next to the highway, so of course, as always, there is a rush of truck sounds and motor sounds in the background that I am fighting against to record, but I do hope that on your end it will be a little bit clearer because we are going to be spending the better part of an hour together. The reason today is because I wanted to read from the Brothers Karamazov. I think that's important. I have mentioned that it is a formative text in the development of Children of Doro, and I would love to be able to share a little bit of why this fiction is so potent and why it allows and invites so much philosophical discourse. As I discussed in another episode, there's a use of polyphonic narration by Dostoevsky, which is very difficult. It is an extension of a broader form of third-person omniscient that was much more popular in other eras. Today we are deeply individualist, and we have difficulty reading and moving through text that holds multiple ideas in tension. That struggle comes through especially in how one chapter, perhaps the most important chapter of the Brothers Karamazov, has been interpreted by quite a few people today, which is to say that it's a compelling deconstruction of Christianity on moral grounds. It indicts the church, it indicts Christ, and there are people who will read this section unto itself, and they'll forget the context around it. They'll forget the fact that it's being held up as one position, and they will forget the character and the complex narrative arc of the character who holds up this position. So a little bit of backstory for ones who haven't seen the other episodes and don't know the piece. It is essentially a murder mystery. It is a story of four brothers, all children of a tyrannical, nasty, brutish man. One of them kills that particular father, and the four of them represent different aspects of humanity. So there is an opportunity before the death to really see different philosophies at play that could lead to destruction, and then after, in the fallout, critically, how all of them are somewhat complicit in the destruction. So just marvelous philosophical fiction and tremendously influential. Quite a few writers in the 20th century owe their own confidence in similar discourse to this piece. We'll talk about that in another episode. I just want to share the Grand Inquisitor. Now, to do that, some of you might not be as familiar with the biblical story. Again, we have two brothers in this scene. Alyosha is the younger. He is a pious, spiritual, searching individual. He wants to know how to live a good life, and he's very open-hearted in a thoughtful, gentle, restorative way. His older brother, Ivan, is an atheist and is an intellectual, and has the capacity to argue splendidly for whatever position he wishes. He has made a life out of argumentation. Does his life of argumentation serve him? No. Even in this chapter, he makes it clear after upsetting his younger brother with this story that he has no clear motivation or fealty to any one position. He is just trying to move through an unjust world as best he can for as long as he can. And later in the book, we will have Ivan wrestle in his own way with a sort of demon in the desert, with the idea that his atheism being spoken to loudly has invited others to terrible acts. This is a common argument, the idea of, if there was no God, anything would be permitted, and so then people would be out there raping and murdering. And I can say as an atheist, I rape and murder exactly as much as I want to, which is not at all without the existence of a God. But it is a very important conversation to have, even outside the parameters of Christianity, the despairing nihilism that is embodied by other characters, and that Ivan feels that he might be complicit in by having been too open about deconstructing Christianity, deconstructing faith when there doesn't seem to be any good secular alternative. These are huge, complicated questions. So although Dostoevsky and I do not share exactly the same cosmology, I find this text to be tremendously potent on its own, and also as an invitation for the rest of us to wrestle with equally important questions. Now, backstory again, for those who are not as biblically savvy, not everybody is familiar with the Christian story, but an extremely important part of the Christian story for any writer is what comes up here. And I say that because we're dealing in this section with Ivan telling a story to his brother, imagining that Christ comes back in the middle of the Inquisition. And so there's a profound discussion between the Grand Inquisitor, who represents the Roman Catholic Church and argues for why the church needed to exist, especially in its form, because of the parameters, the world building essentially, that Christ in his ministry had set. But where does that world building come in? It comes in the wilderness before Galilee. So after baptism, wandering through the desert, Christ is taking on 40 days of fast, and then he'll start his ministry. In the desert, he's tempted 3 times. Very important, because these set important parameters. Oh, if Christ has the power to create miracles, why isn't he just feeding everybody? That's dealt with in the devil tempting him to just turn stone into bread in the desert. Oh, Christ can do miracles, and so therefore, if he really wanted everybody to believe in him, he should have just thrown himself off a cliff and let angels catch him, and obviously then everyone would know he was the beloved Son of God. But that's a kind of arrogance in belief that he denies as well, the devil in the desert. And then the third, the devil's like, you have all these powers. Why don't you just use them to be rich and famous? And so that's the third denial. These are the world-building parameters for this story, incredibly important to justify and explain the limits of action that come later on. So this section focuses on those 3 temptations, the parameters they set, and Ivan uses them to deconstruct the moral limits, I guess it would be a good way of putting it, that exist within Christ's mission as he understands it, and the faith in general, and also articulating why even the most brutish actions of the church suddenly become necessary. That's the framework. Now we're going to listen to the piece itself. Now, I had to decide which version I was going to read from. I was tempted. I really wanted to read the Blavatsky. So the very first translation of the Grand Inquisitor, not the whole novel, but the Grand Inquisitor, happened in 1881. Blavatsky was a mystic. Blavatsky has a sensational, she's a very wacky person with a complicated history, and as any 19th century scholar will tell you. The writing is wonderfully florid in her translation. It has a tremendously theatrical quality to it. I enjoy that version very much. But I decided to go with my first translation, which is the one that I have had with me since the age of 17. This one is Andrew McAndrew. It is an accessible translation. A lot of people will say it's too accessible. They say that it doesn't do enough to reflect the quirks of Russian syntax and structure and vernacular, and that is true. So people argue over translations immensely. Garnet is considered to have a very functional, readable translation that is itself fairly clear and easy to follow. We've got Piver and Volonsky that have a version that's much more Russian, but this one, I think, even though it is more, it's very accessible to us, and as a result loses a little bit of the Russian character. I think for the purposes of sharing the concept of this kind of writing, I think it will allow more readers to follow along. So that's the hope, at least. Let's get started. I hope there aren't any tooting trucks or roaring motos that you can hear. Apologies. You can just think of that as a kind of anachronistic background noise for the events therein. This is probably taking place in a much quieter space, maybe some sounds of nature in the rural landscape outside, but not too much else. Okay, so without further ado, let me just get this set up over here. Very delicate. I'm very happy that the text hasn't fallen apart in all these years. It has a good old book smell to it. That's the lignin working. Okay. Oh yes, and extremely important. Leading into this chapter, we have another very important part of the text, one that Ursula K. Le Guin was inspired by for a story of her own. We'll get into that in another component. But in it, essentially Ivan, the older brother, the atheist, the intellectual, has challenged Alyosha. Could you really tolerate the idea of a heaven that involved the suffering of a small child? Could you forgive a construct like that? And Alyosha acknowledges that he can't, but he rushes to saying he doesn't have to, because there's one perfect person who is the embodiment of forgiveness for all. And so he accuses Ivan in preceding conversation of having forgotten about Christ. And Ivan says, oh, no, I have not forgotten about Christ. And that's why he decides to introduce a poem, is what he calls it, that he has constructed. And for the first time, he's going to share it with another audience. I want to add very quickly that it would not have been possible to write Children of Doro without doing something similar to the Grand Inquisitor. So I have, even though the Bible is not the framing text for my world, a science fiction world, it has its own canonical text called The Sun Master's Journey, which is filled with its own critical anecdotes forming the partnership culture. It has its own deconstruction in the form of what I call the Parasite's Lament. But this is the original source of a challenge to the underpinnings of one's entire society, which is what this chapter is about. Okay, fingers crossed that I can do this in one go, because it's about 9,500 words. That's okay. Thank you for joining me. And I'm so glad, thank you to Elaine for giving me the technology to be able to do this properly with clarity and hopefully no problems with autofocus. All right. The Brothers Karamazov, the Grand Inquisitor chapter. But now that I think of it, I can't just start without some preliminary remarks. I mean, it needs a sort of literary introduction. Ah, hell, Ivan laughed. What kind of an author am I? Well, I want you to understand that the action takes place in the 16th century. And in those days, as you may remember from school, it was usual to bring heavenly powers down to earth, in poetical writing, that is. Not to even mention Dante. In France, the clerks and the monks in monasteries staged plays in which the Virgin, angels, saints, Christ, and even God himself were brought out onto the stage. It was done very naturally then. Victor Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris has a passage about such a play, Le Bon Jugement de la Très Sainte et Gracieuse Vierge Marie, performed under Louis XI in the City Hall of Paris on the Dauphin's birthday. It was considered an edifying play, and admission was free. In the course of the performance, the Virgin comes out on stage and announces her bon jugement in person. We too occasionally had plays like that performed in Moscow in the old days, before the rule of Peter the Great, plays based mostly on Old Testament stories. But besides plays, many stories and poems circulated all over the world at that time, in which saints, angels, and even the supreme heavenly powers appeared whenever their presence was required. In our monasteries, too, monks copied, translated, and even composed such poems, back at the time of the Tartar invasion. One of these monastery-written poems, for instance, is called The Virgin's Journey Through Hell, and it contains some scenes and descriptions as bold as Dante's. In the play, which is obviously influenced by the Greeks, the Mother of God visits hell, where the Archangel Michael is her guide. She sees the sinners being tortured. Incidentally, there is one very interesting category of sinners there. They float on a lake of fire, trying to swim out, but in vain, because God has forgotten about them. Extremely powerful and meaningful words, I think. Shocked and weeping, the Holy Virgin kneels before the throne of God and beseeches him to forgive all those she has seen in hell, every one of them without exception. Her dialogue with God is absolutely fascinating. She pleads, she refuses to give up. God points to the wounds left by the nails on her son's hands and feet and asks, "How can I forgive his tormentors?" She then summons all the saints, all the martyrs, and all the angels and archangels to kneel with her before him and pray for the pardon of all the sinners without exception. In the end, she obtains from God a yearly suspension of all torture between Good Friday and Trinity Sunday. And the sinners in hell thank the Lord and cry out, "You are just in your judgment, O Lord." Well, what I'm trying to tell you is that my own little piece is a bit along such lines, as if it had been written in those days. In my piece, he comes on the scene, and although he doesn't say a word, he just appears and vanishes again. 15 centuries have passed since he promised to come in his glory. 15 centuries since his prophet wrote, "Behold, I come quickly." Of that day and hour knoweth no man, neither the Son but the Father, as he himself announced when he was still on earth. But men still wait for him with the same faith, with the same love, nay, with even greater faith, for 15 centuries have passed without a sign from heaven to mankind. Trust to what your heart will tell you, for from heaven no sign comes. And there is nothing but the faith still alive in the heart. It is true, though, that many miracles happened in those days. There were saints who worked miraculous cures. To some holy men, according to the stories of their lives, the Mother of God came down in person. But the devil was not idle, and among men some started questioning the truth of these miracles. Just then there appeared a deadly new heresy in the north, in Germany. A huge star, bright as a luminary, i.e. the church, fell upon the sources of the waters, and they became bitter. The heretics blasphemously dismissed miracles, but that only made the faith of those who still believed more ardent. And as of old, human tears rose up to him. People still awaited his coming and loved him, and men still placed their hopes in him and were prepared to suffer and die for him. For centuries men had beseeched him with faith and fervor, "O Lord, our God, hasten your coming," and he, in his infinite mercy, had come down to them. He had visited saints, martyrs, and holy hermits while they were still on earth, just as it says in their lives. In Russia, our poet Tyutchev, believing deeply in the truth of his words, wrote, "Through our mother earth entire, wandering his cross he bore, the heavenly king in slave's attire, blessing all he came before." And that is just what happened, believe me. He decided to show himself, if only for a moment, to his people, long-suffering, tormented, sinful people who loved him with a childlike love. My story takes place in Spain, in Seville, during the grimmest days of the Inquisition, when throughout the country fires were burning endlessly to the greater glory of God, and, in autos de fe resplendent, wicked heretics were burned. Of course, this was not the coming in which he had promised to appear in all his heavenly glory at the end of time, and which would be as sudden as a bolt of lightning cutting the sky from east to west. No, he wanted to come only for a moment to visit his children, and he chose to appear where the fires were crackling under the heretics. In his infinite mercy, he came among men in human form, just as he had walked among them 15 centuries before. He came down to that sun-baked southern city the day after nearly 100 heretics had been burned all at once, ad majorem gloriam Dei, in a resplendent auto da fe, by the order of the cardinal, the Grand Inquisitor, and in the presence of the king, the royal court, knights, beautiful ladies in waiting, and the entire population of Seville. He came unobserved and moved about silently, but strangely enough, those who saw him recognized him at once. This might perhaps be the best part of my poem. I mean, if I could explain what made them recognize him. People are drawn to him by an irresistible force. They gather around him, follow him, and soon there is a crowd. He walks among them in silence, a gentle smile of infinite compassion on his lips. The sun of love burns in his heart. Light, understanding, and spiritual power flow from his eyes and set people's hearts vibrating with love for him. He holds his hands out to them, blesses them, and just from touching him or even his clothes comes a healing power. An old man who has been blind from childhood suddenly cries out to him, "Cure me, O Lord, so that I may see you too." And it is as if scales had fallen from his eyes, and the blind man sees him. People weep and kiss the ground on which he walks. Children scatter flowers in his path and cry out to him, "Hosanna, it is he himself," people keep saying. Who else could it be? He stops on the steps of the Cathedral of Seville at a moment when a small white coffin is carried into the church by weeping bearers. In it lies a girl of 7, the only daughter of a prominent man. She lies there amidst flowers. "He will raise your child from the dead," people shout to the weeping mother. The priest who has come out of the cathedral to meet the procession looks perplexed and frowns, but now the mother of the dead child throws herself at his feet, wailing, "If it is truly you, give me back my child." And she stretches out her hands to him. The procession stops. They put the coffin down at his feet. He looks down with compassion. His lips form the words, "Talitha cumi," arise, maiden. And the maiden arises. The little girl sits up in her coffin, opens her little eyes, looks around in surprise and smiles. She holds the white roses that had been placed in her hand when they had laid her in the coffin. There is confusion among the people, shouting and weeping. Just at that moment, the cardinal, the Grand Inquisitor himself, crosses the cathedral square. He is a man of almost 90, tall and erect. His face is drawn, his eyes are sunken, but they still glow as though a spark smoldered in them. Oh, now he is not wearing his magnificent cardinal's robes in which he paraded before the crowds the day before when they were burning the enemies of the Roman Church. No, today he is wearing just the coarse cassock of an ordinary monk. He is followed by his grisly assistants, his slaves, his holy guard. He sees the crowd gathered, stops and watches from a distance. He sees everything, the placing of the coffin at his feet and the girl rising from it. His face darkens. He knits his thick white brows, eyes flash with an ominous fire. He points his finger and orders his guards to seize him. The Grand Inquisitor's power is so great, and the people are so submissive and tremblingly obedient to him, that they immediately open up a passage for the guards. A death-like silence descends upon the square, and in that silence the guards lay hands on him and lead him away. Then everyone in the crowd, to a man, prostrates himself before the Grand Inquisitor. The old man blesses them in silence and passes on. The guards take their prisoner to an old building of the Holy Inquisition and lock him up there in a dark, narrow, vaulted prison cell. The day declines and is replaced by the stifling black southern night of Seville. The air is fragrant with laurel and lemon. Suddenly, in the complete darkness, the iron gate of the cell opens, and there stands the Grand Inquisitor himself, holding a light in his hand. The old man enters the cell alone, and when he is inside, the door closes behind him. He stops, and for a long time, 1 or even 2 minutes, he looks at him. At last, he sets the light down on the table and says, "You? Is it really you?" Receiving no answer, he continues in great haste, "You need not answer me. Say nothing. I know only too well what you could tell me now. Besides, you have no right to add anything to what you said before. Why did you come here to interfere and make things difficult for us? For you came to interfere. You know it. But shall I tell you what will happen tomorrow? Well, I do not know who you really are, nor do I want to know whether you are really he or just a likeness of him. But no later than tomorrow I shall pronounce you the wickedest of all heretics and sentence you to be burned at the stake, and the very people who today were kissing your feet will tomorrow, at a sign of my hand, hasten to your stake to rake the coals. Don't you know it? Oh, yes, I suppose you do," he added, deeply immersed in thought, his eyes fixed for a moment on his prisoner. "I don't quite understand what you're trying to tell me, Ivan," Alyosha said with a smile. Until then he had listened in silence. "Is it just some wild fantasy, or is there a mistake in identity, a quid pro quo by your Grand Inquisitor?" "Why, you may assume the latter if you wish," Ivan said laughingly. since, as I see, you have been so spoiled by our contemporary brand of realism that you cannot accept anything that is a bit fantastic. If you wish to call it an error of identity, all right, so be it. It is a fact, though," he said, starting to laugh again, "that the Inquisitor is 90 years old, so he has had plenty of time to have been driven completely out of his mind by his idée fixe. As to his prisoner, he may have been struck by the man's looks, or perhaps he was just having hallucinations, which can easily happen to a 90-year-old man close to death, and what's more, excited by the previous day's burning at the stake of 100 heretics. But really, why should we care whether it is a wild fantasy or a quid pro quo? What matters is that the old man must speak his mind. At 90, this is the first time that he is saying aloud something about which he has kept silent all those 90 years. And the prisoner? He just looks at him and says nothing? Why, yes, Ivan laughed once more, and that's as it should be in any case. Besides, the old man himself reminds him that he may not add a single word to what he has said before. I might add that this may be the most crucial feature of Roman Catholicism, at least the way I see it. It's as if the Grand Inquisitor said to him, "You have transmitted all your authority to the Pope, and now he wields it. As to you, you had better stay away, or at any rate not interfere with us, for the time being." They don't just say that, they even have it in writing, at least the Jesuits have. I've read it myself in the works of their theologians. "Do you think you have the right to reveal even a single mystery of the world from which you come?" the Grand Inquisitor asks him, and then answers himself, "No, you do not, for you may not add anything to what has been said before, and you may not deprive men of the freedom you defended so strongly when you were on earth. Anything new that you might reveal to them now would encroach upon the freedom of their faith, for it would come to them as a miracle. And 15 centuries ago, it was freely given faith that was most important to you. Didn't you often tell them then that you wanted to make them free? Well then," the old man adds with a grin, "so now you have seen free men." "Yes, that business cost us a great deal," he continues, looking sternly at him, "but at least in your name we saw it through. For 1,500 years we were pestered by that notion of freedom, but in the end we succeeded in getting rid of it, and now we are rid of it for good. You don't believe that we got rid of it, do you? You look at me so gently, and you do not even consider me worthy of your anger. I want you to know, though, that on this very day men are convinced that they are freer than they have ever been, although they themselves brought us their freedom and put it meekly at our feet. This is what we have achieved, but was it really what you wanted? Was this the freedom that you wanted to bring them?" "I'm afraid I'm lost again," Alyosha interrupted Ivan. "Is he being sarcastic? Is he laughing at him?" "He certainly is not. Indeed, he is claiming for himself and his church the credit for having done away with freedom and having thus given happiness to mankind. It is only now," he says, obviously thinking of the Inquisition, "that it has become possible for the first time to think of men's happiness. Man is a rebel by nature, and how can a rebel be happy? You were warned," he says to him. "There was no lack of warnings and signs, but you chose to ignore them. You spurned the only way that could have brought happiness to men. Fortunately, though, you allowed us to take over from you when you left. You made commitments to us. You sealed them with your word. You gave us the right to loosen and to bind their shackles. And of course, you cannot think of depriving us of that right now. Why then have you come to interfere with us now?" "What does that mean? There was no lack of warnings and signs," Alyosha said. "Well, that's precisely the most important point the old man must make. The wise and dreaded spirit of self-destruction and non-existence," the old man went on, "spoke to you in the desert, and we learn from the books that he tried to tempt you. Was he really trying to tempt you, though? Could anything be truer than what he revealed to you in his 3 questions that you rejected, questions that were called temptations in the books? And yet, If a truly blinding miracle has ever happened on this earth, it happened that day in the form of those 3 temptations. And it was precisely in those 3 questions that the miracle lay. If, for instance, those 3 questions asked by the dread spirit had been lost and we had had to rediscover and reinvent them, we would have had to assemble for that purpose all the world's wise men, rulers, high priests, scholars, philosophers, and poets, and to ask them to formulate 3 questions that would not only fit the magnitude of the occasion, but also express in a few words, in 3 brief human sentences, the whole future of the world and of mankind. Do you really believe that the combined wisdom of the earth could produce anything comparable in strength and depth to those 3 questions that the wise and powerful Spirit asked you that day in the desert? From those questions alone, from the miracle of their formulation, it must be clear that it is not a matter of a transient human mind, but of something absolute and outside time, for those 3 questions contain the entire future history of man, and they offer 3 symbols that reconcile all the irreconcilable strivings on earth which derive from the contradictions of human nature. It was not as clear at that time because the future was still unknown, but now, 15 centuries later, we can see that in those questions everything was perfectly foreseen and predicted and has proved so true that there is nothing we can add or subtract anymore. Judge for yourself then who was right, you or the one who questioned you. Do you remember the first question? It was worded differently, but this is its purport. You wanted to come into the world, and you came empty-handed with nothing but some vague promise of freedom which, in their simple-mindedness and innate irresponsibility, men cannot even conceive, and which they fear and dread, for there has never been anything more difficult for man and for human society to bear than freedom. And now do you see those stones in this parched and barren desert? Turn them into loaves of bread, and men will follow you like cattle, grateful and docile, although constantly fearful lest you withdraw your hand and they lose your loaves. But you did not want to deprive man of freedom, and you rejected this suggestion, for you thought, what sort of freedom would they have if their obedience was bought with bread? You replied that man does not live by bread alone, but do you know that for the sake of that earthly bread, the spirit of the earth will rise up against you, will confront and conquer you, and they will all follow him, shouting, "Who is there to match the beast who has brought us fire from heaven?" Do you know that more centuries will pass, and men of wisdom and learning will proclaim that there is no such thing as crime, that there is therefore no sin either, that there are only hungry people? Feed us first, then ask for virtue. That will be the motto on the banners of those who will oppose you, of those who will raise your temple and build in its place a new terrifying Tower of Babel. And although they will never complete it any more than they did the last one, nevertheless you could have prevented men from making the second attempt to build the tower, and thus have shortened their sufferings by 1,000 years. For in the end it is to us that they will come, after this unnecessary 1,000 years of torment. They will find us hiding somewhere underground, hiding again in the catacombs, for we shall again be persecuted and tortured, and they will beg us, "Give us food," for those who promised us fire from heaven have not given it to us. And that will be the day when we shall finish building their tower for them, for the one who feeds them will be the one who finishes building it, and we will be the ones capable of feeding them, and we shall give them bread in your name and lie, telling them that it is in your name. Oh, never, never would they be able to feed themselves without us. There is no knowledge that could supply them with bread as long as they remain free. So in the end they will lay their freedom at our feet and say to us, "Enslave us, but feed us." And they will finally understand that freedom and the assurance of daily bread for everyone are 2 incompatible notions that could never coexist. They will also discover that men can never be free because they are weak, corrupt, worthless, and restless. You promised them heavenly bread, but I repeat, how can that bread compete with earthly bread in dealing with the weak, ungrateful, permanently corrupt human species? And even if hundreds or thousands of men follow you for the sake of heavenly bread, what will happen to the millions who are too weak to forego their earthly bread? Or is it only the thousands of the strong and mighty who are dear to your heart, while the millions of others, the weak ones, who love you too, weak as they are, and who are as numerous as the grains of sand on the beach, are to serve as material for the strong and mighty? But we are concerned with the weak too. They are corrupt and undisciplined, but in the end they will be the obedient ones. They will marvel at us and worship us like gods, because by becoming their masters, we have accepted the burden of freedom that they were too frightened to face, just because we have agreed to rule over them. That is how terrifying freedom will have become to them finally. We shall tell them, though, that we are loyal to you, and that we rule over them in your name. We shall be lying, because we do not intend to allow you to come back. And it is in this deception that our suffering will consist, because we will have to lie. So this is the meaning of the first question you were asked in the desert, and this is what you rejected in the name of the freedom that you put above all else. And yet that question contains one of the great mysteries on which our world is founded. Had you been willing to give them bread, you would have satisfied the eternal craving of both individual man and human society as a whole, to have someone to worship. There is nothing a free man is so anxious to do as to find something to worship. But it must be something unquestionable that all men can agree to worship communally. For the great concern of these miserable creatures is not that every individual should find something to worship that he personally considers worthy of worship, but that they should find something in which they can all believe, in which they can all worship in common. It is essential that it should be in common, and it is precisely that requirement of shared worship that has been the principal source of suffering for individual man and the human race since the beginning of history. In their efforts to impose universal worship, men have unsheathed their swords and killed one another. They have invented gods and challenged each other. Discard your gods and worship mine, or I will destroy both your gods and you. And this is how it will be until the end of time, even after gods have vanished from the earth, for they are bound in the end to yield to idols. You couldn't help knowing this fundamental mystery of human nature, and knowing it, you nevertheless spurned the only banner that was offered you, that would have made them follow you and worship you without a murmur, the banner of earthly bread. But you chose to reject it in the name of freedom, in the name of spiritual bread, and look what you did after that, again in the name of freedom. I tell you once more that man has no more pressing, agonizing need than the need to find someone to whom he can hand over as quickly as possible the gift of freedom with which the poor wretch comes into the world. But only one who can appease a man's conscience can take his freedom from him. In bread you were offered something that could have brought you indisputable loyalty. You would give man bread, and man would bow down to you, because there is nothing more indisputable than bread. But if at the same time someone else succeeded in capturing his conscience, then man might even spurn your bread and follow the one who ensnared his conscience. This is something about which you were right, for the mystery of human existence lies not in just staying alive, but in finding something to live for. Without a concrete idea of what he is living for, man would refuse to live, would rather exterminate himself than remain on this earth, even if bread were scattered all around him. That is so, but what came of it? Instead of seizing men's freedom, you gave them even more of it. Have you forgotten that peace and even death is more attractive to man than the freedom of choice that derives from the knowledge of good and evil? There is nothing more alluring to man than freedom of conscience, but neither is anything more agonizing. And yet, instead of giving them something tangible to calm their consciences forever, you came to them with words that were unfamiliar, vague, and indefinite. You offered them something that was quite beyond them. It even looked as if you didn't love them, you who came to give them your life. Instead of ridding men of their freedom, you increased their freedom, and you imposed everlasting torment on man's soul. You wanted to gain man's love so that he would follow you of his own free will, fascinated and captivated by you. In place of the clear and rigid ancient law, you made man decide about good and evil for himself, with no other guidance than your example. But did it ever occur to you that man would disregard your example, even question it as well as your truth, when he was subjected to so fearful a burden as freedom of choice? In the end, they will shout that you did not bring them the truth, because it is impossible to have left them in greater confusion and misery than you did, leaving them with so many anxieties and unsolved problems. You see, then, you yourself sowed the seeds of destruction for your own kingdom, and no one else is to blame. And think now, was this the best that you could offer them? There are 3 forces, only 3 on this earth, that can overcome and capture once and for all the conscience of these feeble, undisciplined creatures so as to give them happiness. These forces are miracle, mystery, and authority. But you rejected the first, the second, and the third of these forces, and set up your rejection as an example to men. When the wise and dreaded spirit placed you on the pinnacle of the temple and said, "If you would know whether you are the Son of God, then cast yourself down, for it is written, the angels shall hold him up lest he fall and bruise himself. And you shall know then whether you are the Son of God, and shall prove how great is your faith in your Father." You heard him out, then rejected his advice, withstood the temptation, and did not plunge from the pinnacle. Oh, of course, you acted proudly and magnificently. Indeed, you acted like God. But can you expect as much of men of that weak, undisciplined, and wretched tribe, who are certainly no gods? Oh, you knew very well at that moment that if you had made the slightest move to jump, you would have tempted God, proving you had lost your faith in him, and you would have been smashed against the earth that you had come to save, and would thus have gladdened the wise spirit who is tempting you. But again, how many are there like you? Could you possibly imagine, even for 1 second, that men would be able to withstand such a temptation? Is human nature such that it can reject a miracle when confronted with the most frightening choices, the most heartbreaking dilemmas, and remain facing them with nothing but freedom of choice? And you knew only too well that your act would be recorded in books, that it would reach the remotest corners of the earth and be passed on down to the end of time. Did you really expect that man would follow your example and remain with God without recourse to miracles? Didn't you know that whenever man rejects miracles, he rejects God, because he seeks not so much God and as miracles? And since man cannot live without miracles, he will provide himself with miracles of his own making. He will believe in witchcraft and sorcery, even though he may otherwise be a heretic, an atheist, and a rebel. You did not come down from the cross when they shouted, taunting and challenging you, "Come down from the cross and we will believe that you are he." You did not come down again because you did not want to bring man to you by miracles, because you wanted their freely given love rather than the servile rapture of slaves subdued forever by a display of power. And here again you overestimated men, for they are certainly nothing but slaves. And although they were created rebels by nature, look around and judge for yourself. 15 centuries have passed. Examine them. Whom have you raised up to yourself? I swear that man is weaker and viler than you thought. How could he possibly do what you did? By paying him such respect, you acted as if you lacked compassion for him, because you demanded too much of him, and that from you, who love him more than yourself. Had you respected him less, you would have demanded less of him, and that would have been more like love. for the burden you placed on him would not have been so heavy. Man is weak and despicable. What if today he rebels everywhere against our authority and is proud of his rebellion? It is a childish pride, the pride of a schoolboy, of little children rioting in their classroom and driving out their teacher. But the end will come soon, and they will have to pay dearly for their fun. They will raise churches and flood the earth with blood, but the stupid children will finally realize themselves that although they are rebels, they are weak and are unable to bear their own rebellion. Shedding their silly tears, they will finally admit that he who created them He who had created them rebels intended to mock them and no more. They will say it in despair, and it will be blasphemy, and then they will be even more unhappy, because human nature cannot bear blasphemy, and in the end always punishes itself for it. And so man's lot is nothing but unrest, confusion, and unhappiness. After all the suffering you bore for their freedom, your great prophet had a vision and told us in an allegory that he had seen all those who were in the first resurrection, and that there were 12,000 of them from each tribe. But if there were so many, they must have been gods rather than men. They bore your cross, endured years and years of hunger in a barren wilderness, living on roots and locusts. And of course, you can point proudly at these children of freedom, at their freely given love, and at their magnificent suffering for your sake. Remember, though, there were only a few thousand of them, and even these were gods rather than men. But what about the rest? Why should the rest of mankind, the weak ones, suffer because they are unable to stand what the strong ones can? Why is it the fault of a weak soul if he cannot live up to such terrifying gifts? Can it really be true that you came only for the chosen few? If that is so, it is a mystery that we cannot understand, and if it is a mystery, we have the right to preach to man that what matters is not freedom of choice or love, but a mystery that he must worship blindly, even at the expense of his conscience. And that is exactly what we have done. We have corrected your work and have now founded it on miracle, mystery, and authority. And men rejoice at being led like cattle again, with the terrible gift of freedom that brought them so much suffering removed from them. Tell me, were we right in preaching and acting as we did? Was it not our love for men that made us resign ourselves to the idea of their impotence and lovingly try to lighten the burden of their responsibility, even allowing their weak nature to sin, but with our permission? Why have you come to interfere with our work? And why do you look at me silently with those gentle eyes of yours? Be angry with me. I do not want your love because I do not love you myself. Why should I go on pretending that I do not know to whom I am speaking? Everything I have to say, you already know. I can read it in your eyes. How could I expect to hide our secret from you? But perhaps you want to hear it from my own lips. Listen then, we are not with you, we are with him. That is our secret, our mystery. We have been with him and not with you for a long time, for 8 centuries already. Exactly 8 centuries ago, we accepted from him what you rejected with indignation, the last gift he offered you, all the kingdom of earth. We accepted Rome and Caesar's sword from him, and we proclaimed ourselves the sole rulers of the earth, although to this day we have not yet succeeded in bringing our work to final completion. But you know who is to blame for that. Our work is only beginning, but at least it has begun. And although its completion is still a long way off and the earth will have to face much suffering until then, in the end we shall prevail. We will be Caesars, and then we shall devise a plan for universal happiness. But you could have taken Caesar's sword when you first came. Why did you reject that last gift? Had you accepted the third offering of the mighty Spirit, you would have fulfilled man's greatest need on earth, that is, the need to find someone to worship, someone who can relieve him of the burden of his conscience, thus enabling him finally to unite into a harmonious anthill where there are no dissenting voices, for the unquenchable thirst for universal unity is the third and last ordeal of man. Men have always striven to be organized into a universal whole. There have been many great nations with a glorious past history, but the higher the stage of development they reached, the greater was their discontent, because they became more and more obsessed with the need for universal unification. The great conquerors, the Tamerlanes and the Genghis Khans, who swept like whirlwinds across the earth, striving to subdue the whole world, were also, even if they were unaware of themselves, obeying that eternal human craving for universal union. Had you accepted Caesar's purple, you would have founded a universal empire and given men everlasting peace. For who can rule men if not one who holds both their consciences and their bread? So we took Caesar's sword, and by taking it we rejected you and followed him. Oh, there will still be centuries of chaos in which men will be guided by their own unbridled thinking, by their science, and by their cannibal instincts. For since they started building their Tower of Babel without us, they will end up devouring each other. But it will be just at that moment that the beast will crawl to us, lick our feet, and spatter them with tears of blood. And we shall saddle and mount the beast and raise the cup on which the word mystery is engraved. Then and only then will the reign of peace and happiness come to men. You pride yourself on your chosen ones, but you have only the chosen, while we will bring peace of mind to all men. And that is not all. How many of those strong enough to be among the chosen have already or will in the future take their mighty minds and ardent hearts away from you and give them to some other cause, in the end raising their free banner against you? Yet you were the one who gave them that banner. Under us it will be different. Under us they will all be happy, and they will not rise in rebellion and kill one another all the world over, as they are doing now with the freedom you gave them. Oh, we will convince them that they will only be free when they have surrendered their freedom and submitted to us. And that will be the truth, will it not? Or do you think that we will be deceiving them? They will find out for themselves that we are right, for they will remember the horrors of chaos and enslavement that your freedom brought them. Freedom, free thinking, and science will lead men into such confusion and confront them with such dilemmas and insoluble riddles that the fierce and rebellious will destroy one another. Others who are rebellious but weaker will destroy themselves, while the weakest and most miserable will crawl to our feet and cry out to us, "Yes, you were right. You alone possessed his secret, and we have come back to you. Save us from ourselves." And when they receive bread from us, they will be clearly aware that it is bread they have earned with their own hands, the same bread we took away from them, that we perform no miracles by turning stones into bread, and yet the fact that they receive it from our hands will make them happier than the bread itself. For they will remember only too well that without us, this same bread that they earned turned to stones in their hands, whereas after they came to us, the stones in their hands were turned back into bread. Ah, they will value all too highly the advantages to be derived from submitting to us once and for all, and as long as men do not understand this, they will be unhappy. Now tell me, who is most to blame for their failure to understand? Who was it who broke up the human herd and sent men along innumerable unexplored paths? The herd will be gathered together and tamed again, however, and this time for good. And then we shall give them tranquil, humble happiness, suitable for such weak creatures. Oh, we shall have to convince them finally that they must not be proud, for by overestimating them, you instilled pride in them. We shall prove to them that they are nothing but weak, pathetic children, but that a child's happiness is the sweetest of all. They will grow timid and cling to us in fear like chicks to a hen. They will admire us, be terrified of us, and be proud of the strength and wisdom that enabled us to subdue a turbulent herd of many millions. They will tremble abjectly before our wrath. They will become timorous. Their eyes will fill with tears as readily as those of women and children, but at the slightest sign from us, they will just as readily change to mirth, laughter, and untarnished joy. And they will burst into a happy children's song. Yes, we shall force them to work, but in their leisure hours we shall organize their lives into a children's game, in which they will sing children's songs together and perform innocent dances. Oh, we shall allow them to sin too, for weak and defenseless as they are, they will love us like children if we allow them to sin. We shall tell them that every sin they commit with our permission can be expiated, and that we allow them to sin because we love them, and that we shall take upon ourselves the punishment for their acts. And we shall indeed take their sins upon ourselves, and they will adore us as their saviors, who will answer to God for the sins they, the weak, commit. And they will have no secrets from us. We shall allow them or forbid them to live with their wives or mistresses, to have or not have children, all according to the degree of their obedience to us. And they will submit to us with cheerfulness and joy. They will tell us the secrets that most torment their consciences. They will tell us everything, and we shall solve all their problems, and they will trust to our solutions completely, because they will be rid of the terrible worry and the frightening torment they know today when they have to decide for themselves how to act. And everyone will be happy, all the millions of beings, with the exception of the 100,000 men who are called upon to rule over them. For only we, the keepers of the secret, will be unhappy. There will be millions upon millions of happy babes and 100,000 sufferers who have accepted the burden of the knowledge of good and evil. They will die peacefully with your name on their lips, but beyond the grave they will find nothing but death. But we shall keep the secret, and for their own happiness we shall dangle before them the reward of eternal heavenly bliss. For we know that even if there is something in the other world, it is certainly not for such as they. They say in prophecy that you will come again with your proud, strong chosen ones, and that you will be triumphant. But our answer will be that those around you have saved only themselves, whereas we have saved all mankind. It is said that the whore who rides the beast and holds the mystery in her hands will be put to shame, that the weak will rise and rend her royal robes and expose her vile naked body. But I will rise then and show you the millions upon millions of happy babes who have known no sin, and we, who have taken their sins upon us to give them happiness, will stand up and say to you, judge us if you can and if you dare. Know that I am not afraid of you. Know that I too lived in the wilderness, fed upon roots and locusts, that I too blessed the freedom which you bestowed upon men, and that I too was prepared to take my place among the strong chosen ones, aspiring to be counted among them. But I came to my senses and refused to serve a mad cause. I turned away and joined those who were endeavoring to correct your work. I left the proud and turned to the meek for the happiness of the meek. What I have told you will happen, and our kingdom will come. I repeat, tomorrow you will see obedient herds. At the first sign from me, hurry to heap coals on the fire beneath the stake at which I shall have you burned, because by coming here you have made our task more difficult. For if anyone has ever deserved our fire, it is you, and I shall have you burned tomorrow. DC. Ivan stopped. His emotion had gradually increased as he spoke, reaching its highest point at the end. But when he stopped, he suddenly smiled. Alyosha, who at first had listened in silence, had also become very agitated toward the end. He looked as if he wanted to interrupt his brother and was restraining himself with great difficulty. Now, when Ivan stopped, words gushed from him as if he could no longer hold them back. But it makes no sense, he cried, turning red. Your poem is no disparagement of Christ as you intended. It is in praise of him. And who will accept what you say of freedom in the way you want it to be understood? Is that the way the Russian Orthodox Church interprets it? That is the reasoning of a Roman Catholic, but it doesn't even give a fair picture of their views either. It represents only the worst there is in Catholicism, its inquisitors and Jesuits. Besides, your inquisitor is too fantastic. Such a character is quite impossible. And what sort of sins of others do these people take upon themselves? And also, who are these keepers of the secret, of the mystery, who are willing to bear some peculiar curse for the sake of the happiness of mankind? Who has ever heard of them? We know there are Jesuits with a pretty bad reputation, but they are nothing like what you describe. They are nothing like that. In fact, they're simply the Pope's army preparing the way for the establishment of their future empire on earth with the Roman pontiff at its head. That is their actual goal, and there is no mystery or sad, noble resignation in it. Theirs is a plain and simple lust for power, low, despicable, material advantages, enslavement of the people, something like Russian serfdom used to be, with them as the landowners. That's all they are after. They may not even believe in God for all I know. No, your tormented inquisitor is nothing but a figment of your fantasy. Wait a minute, don't get so excited, Ivan laughed. You say it is a fantasy. Very good. I concede it most certainly is a fantasy. Tell me one thing, though. Do you really believe that during these centuries the Catholics have directed all their efforts merely at seizing power in order to gain what you call low, despicable material advantages? Did you get that by any chance from that Father Passy of yours? No, not at all. In fact, once Father Passy said something that resembles a bit of what you were saying. But no, of course, it wasn't the same thing at all, Alyosha added hurriedly, as if as an afterthought. I'm delighted to hear it, although you say it wasn't the same thing at all. What I'm asking you is this: do you really think that the Jesuits and Inquisitors would plot like that for the sake of mere, despicable material advantages? Why couldn't there be among them one martyr, a man filled with great sadness and love for his fellow men? Just assume that, among all those interested only in material gain, there is one, only one, man like my Grand Inquisitor, who has lived en route by himself in the wilderness, who has writhed in agony to overcome the needs of the flesh in his efforts to gain freedom and perfection. Then that man, who has always loved his fellow men, suddenly realizes how puny is the mortal satisfaction of achieving a triumph of will, when he is convinced that millions of other children of God have been created as a sort of mockery, that they will never be able to cope with the freedom that has been forced upon them, that these wretched rebels will never grow into giants who will complete the construction of the Tower of Babel. It was not geese such as these that our great idealist visualized joining in the final harmony. And so, having understood that, he turns around and joins them, the intelligent people. Why can't you imagine that something like that could happen? Whom did he join, did you say? Who are these intelligent people? Alyosha cried, almost angrily. There's nothing so very intelligent about them, nor do they have any secrets or mysteries. Their only secret is their godlessness, and your Inquisitor's only secret is that he doesn't believe in God. That's all. Fine. Let's assume you are right. You've guessed it at last, and it's true. That is the only secret he has. But wouldn't a man who had spent his whole life in the wilderness performing acts of self-sacrifice and devotion without curing himself of his love and concern for mankind, wouldn't such a man suffer? In the last years that are left to him, it becomes clear to him that only the guidance of the great, wise, and dreaded Spirit would make it possible to organize feeble and undisciplined men in such a way as to make their lives bearable, for they are just unfinished, ridiculous attempts, created in mockery. He becomes convinced that his duty is to follow the instructions of the wise spirit of death and destruction. And so he is willing to use lies and deception to lead men consciously to their death and destruction, while at the same time deceiving them so they will not see where they are being led, so that at least on the way these wretched, blind creatures may think they are happy. And I want you to note that the old Inquisitor will be deceiving them in the name of the one in whom he believed so ardently for most of his life. Isn't that suffering? Tell me. And if even just one man like that finds himself at the head of the whole army of those who crave nothing but power and despicable material gains, even so, wouldn't one such man be enough to make it a tragedy? I'll go even further. I say that with one such man at their head, they would be a true guiding ideal for the whole Roman Church with its armies and its Jesuits. I am also absolutely convinced that there has never been any lack of such individuals among those who head their movement. Possibly even some of the popes themselves were such exceptional individuals. And who knows, perhaps a tormented old man who loves mankind as stubbornly as my Inquisitor exists today. Perhaps there is even a whole army of such individuals, and perhaps they exist not by mere chance, but as the result of combined efforts to form an alliance whose aim is to keep the secret from the weak and the wretched in order to make them happy. This, I am sure, is true because it is bound to be. I even have the impression that the Freemasons are founded on a mystery of that sort, which would explain why the Catholics hate them, seeing in them competitors threatening to split their unifying idea, for they believe that there must be only one shepherd and one herd. But in defending my idea this way, I sound like an author who cannot bear criticism, so we might as well talk about something else. Perhaps you're a Mason yourself, Alyosha blurted out angrily, but then added at once with great sadness, you don't really believe in God. He had the impression that his brother was looking at him sarcastically. He lowered his eyes and asked, does it have an ending, your poem, or is that how it ends? Here's how I propose to end it, Ivan said, continuing. The Grand Inquisitor falls silent and waits for some time for the prisoner to answer. The prisoner's silence has weighed on him. He has watched him. He has listened to him intently, looking gently into his eyes and apparently unwilling to speak. The old man longs for him to say something, however painful and terrifying, but instead he suddenly goes over to the old man and kisses him gently on his old, bloodless lips, and that is his only answer. The old man is startled and shudders. The corners of his lips seem to quiver slightly. He walks to the door, opens it, and says to him, go now, and do not come back. Ever. You must never, never come again. And he lets the prisoner out into the dark streets of the city. The prisoner leaves. And what about the old man? The kiss glows in his heart, but the old man sticks to his old idea. And you too? You stick to it? Alyosha cried out bitterly. Ivan laughed. You know what, he said, it's all nonsense, really, a meaningless poem by a scatterbrained student who's never written 2 lines of poetry in his life. Why must you take it so seriously? Or do you expect me to rush off at once and join the crowd of Jesuits devising corrections of his work? Don't you understand that I really don't give a damn about anything? That, as I told you before, I'm only interested in lasting out until I'm 30, because by then I'll be willing to throw down the cup of life. And what about your sticky little leaves and the graves that are so dear to you, and the blue sky and the woman you love? Alyosha said bitterly. How will you be able to live until then and love all those things with the hell that is in your heart and in your head? No, you are going to join them now, or else you will kill yourself, because you won't be able to stand it. There is a drive in me that can withstand anything, Ivan said coldly with a twisted grin. What drive? The Karamazov drive, the vile earthly drive. You mean you plan to drown yourself in debauchery, to disintegrate your soul by rotting it? Is that what you want? Something like that, I guess, though I'll avoid it until I'm 30, but after that, well, yes. And how do you intend to avoid it until then? How will you manage it with those ideas of yours? There again, I'll act like a Karamazov. By that you mean you'll act as if everything is permitted, for you feel that's true. Whatever you do is all right? Ivan frowned and suddenly turned very pale. Now you've picked up the phrase that shocked Miusov so much yesterday and that Dmitri picked up and repeated rather naively, Ivan said, smiling crookedly. Well, since you've brought it up, I suppose everything is permitted, just as I said. I don't take it back, and I don't dislike our dear Mitya's formation either. Alyosha stared at him in silence. Ah, my little Alyosha, I thought that when I left this town you would be the only friend I had in the world, Ivan said with sudden feeling, but now I realize that there is no room for me even in your heart, my dear recluse. Well, I won't go back on my idea that everything is permitted, but then will you too turn your back on me? Alyosha stood up, walked over to him, and without a word, kissed him on the lips. That's plagiarism, Ivan shouted, suddenly beaming with delight. A very long reading. I apologize for any little glitches along the way, but thank you very much for sharing in that. As you can see, there's a lot of force that went into literature of a different period. There was a sincerity, and I do look forward to being able to share my own version of that sincerity in Children of Doro, which will publish May 4th. and then be thereafter available online, ebook, paperback, via Amazon. But more importantly, I look forward to connecting more with other writers pursuing the same. They are out there. There are a lot of sincere writers. And just because we live in a moment where a different kind of writing is prioritized, a more individualist writing, more confidence in singular points of view, that tension, that willingness to grapple with the deepest questions of existence persists, because humans always do. So thank you so very much. Have yourselves a lovely day, and we will touch base to talk more about Children of Doro and Dostoevsky and other publishing themes in future episodes. Take care.